In 2020, the global economy suffered its largest peacetime contraction since the Great Depression. Global GDP shrank by 3.5% as mobility restrictions brought public life to a halt. Today, as military conflict keeps the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed, markets and policymakers are reflexively benchmarking the crisis against that 2020 pandemic experience. They are mapping a sudden demand collapse onto a physical blockade trapping 20 million barrels of oil per day on the open ocean. Using the pandemic as a baseline for the 2026 energy shock is a category error. It systematically understates the severity of the current crisis. Misdiagnosing the mechanics of a systemic shock leads directly to fatal policy errors. To survive this, we need a completely different analytical framework. The COVID-19 pandemic was a crisis of process. The movement of workers paused, logistics pipelines stalled, but physical infrastructure remained intact. Factories idled, the grid stayed on. The Hormuz blockade is a crisis of substance. It excises the physical inputs, energy, petrochemicals, and fertilizers upon which industrial civilization runs. This five-dimensional comparative framework demonstrates why a crisis of substance cannot be managed like a crisis of process. We will examine the supply shock, inflationary dynamics, geopolitical asymmetry, food system vulnerability, and long-run recovery constraints. The distinction between the two crises comes down to raw survivability. A disrupted process can ultimately be restarted, but a missing physical substance halts production entirely. This chart illustrates the near-linear coupling between energy and GDP output. Energy is consumed upon use and must be continuously replenished. By April 2026, the Hormuz closure removed 12.8 million barrels per day. The corresponding GDP drop is mechanical. When Qatar Energy declared force majeure following attacks in early March, this leads to preemptive price hikes and inventory hoarding, creating a self-amplified spiral. This creates a genuine policy trap. If central banks raise interest rates to control this inflation, they deepen a supply shortage recession. Cutting interest rates to support economic growth risks the other side of the trap, accelerating the structural inflation spiral. The macroeconomic toolkit that stabilized the global economy in 2020 is mathematically useless against a structural excision of energy. The COVID-19 pandemic impacted advanced and developing nations roughly equally through demand collapse. No nation was existentially exempt. The Hormuz closure operates as an asymmetric weapon. Its devastation scales directly with a nation's reliance on Middle Eastern hydrocarbons and the Strait's specific corridor. This map tracks crude oil flowing into East Asia. Entering this crisis, Japan sourced 95. A blockade at the Strait chokes off this primary route, leaving no viable alternatives. By March 2026, Japan's crude imports hit their lowest point since 1989. South Korean crackers have been forced to operate at minimum rates or declare force majeure because they lack the physical inputs to run. For highly exposed nations, the blockade threatens the industrial continuity that sustains their entire economic model. Current policy responses also overlook a critical blind spot. Modern industrial agriculture is, mechanically speaking, a system for converting fossil fuels into calories. The pandemic delayed distribution, but seeds, fuel, and fertilizer remained available. The Hormuz scenario chokes off the physical existence of those agricultural inputs. Much of the global food system relies directly on Qatari natural gas and regional petrochemicals to synthesize ammonia and urea. When those LNG shipments vanished from the market, the foundational building blocks of global fertilizer synthesis went with them. The consequences of this input shock operate on a strict lag. A fertilizer shortage in early 2026 dictates yield failures in the next growing season. This damage is mathematically baked in, yet invisible in current data. Policymakers are effectively reacting to a crisis that hasn't officially registered yet. The 2021 rebound was achievable because the primary constraint on growth was fear of infection. Once vaccines deployed, labor returned, and demand rapidly recovered. The Hormuz crisis presents physical infrastructure scarring that prevents a rapid restart. Consider the extraction sites. Oil wells that underwent hasty shut-ins when the conflict began will require up to 9 months of complex reservoir management just to return to their prior baselines. Qatar Energy has indicated that direct damage to its Ras Laffan LNG facilities could take up to 5 years to fully repair. The International Energy Agency calculates that even if the Strait of Hormuz reopens immediately, re-establishing steady pre-conflict export volumes will take months. This gauge tracks global oil inventories, hitting an 8-year low in May 2026. The world operates on a perilously thin buffer of 101 days. Strategic reserves are being drawn down unsustainably, projected to drop to just 98 days of cover. The pandemic left the physical world ready to rebound, but the global energy system has suffered deep structural damage that will severely constrain economic output. This matrix summarizes the reality. Across every measured metric, from inflation profiles to food security, the Hormuz closure is categorically worse than the 2020 pandemic. The primary counterargument relies on the idea that strategic reserves have successfully buffered past Middle Eastern supply shocks. Past crises affected only partial supply, allowing alternative routes to compensate. Today, virtually all spare production capacity is trapped behind one impassable choke point. This strike hits a global trade network already operating with depleted buffers, making a disruption here lethal to highly optimized logistics. Deploying the pandemic playbook, relying on fiscal stimulus and patience, is a dangerous response to an absolute physical shortage of energy. Policymakers most recognize this as a permanent downward shift in global energy capacity, rather than a temporary pause in activity. This transition marks the end of an era defined by seamless processes, and the beginning of one defined by scarce substances. The global economy must abandon the illusion of a rapid recovery. The only viable path forward is immediate structural adaptation to a higher cost,